as I was saying, I'm not going to teach you anything that you don't already do intuitively, because we're hardwired to reason, to think deeply about issues, to question premises, and that sort of thing. And so what I'm going to teach you, you're already familiar with, especially having been debaters. It's just that there's no substitute for a theoretical understanding if you're attempting to cultivate an art. And so there's a huge difference between intuition and art. When we talk about the art of rhetoric, the Greek word for art is techne. Techne is defined by Joseph Dunn in his book, Back to the Rough Ground, this way. The kind of knowledge possessed by an expert maker, it gives him a clear conception of the why and wherefore, the how and the with what of the making process, and enables him, through the capacity to offer a rational account of it, to preside over his activity with secure mastery. Do not try to write that whole thing down. It's on the rhetoric ring in about 4 different places, all right? But just think about the image that conjures in your mind's eye. Through the capacity to explain not only the how and the what of the making process, but also the why and the wherefore, it gives the artist the ability to preside over his art with secure mastery. I love the image of that, a person sitting there with a staff looking down over his artistry, and so the art of rhetoric is about eloquence, about thinking quickly on your feet, being at home in the realm of ideas. I would wager that Isaiah uses some of those phrases when he's teaching, as a matter of fact, because that's what rhetoric is really about. Cultivating mental habits that make you an eloquent person. To listen critically, to think deeply, and then respond appropriately, given the nature of the question at hand. Like I said, we do all these things intuitively, but when it comes to art, the more I study Aristotle, the more I realize he has a modus operandi that includes about 4 steps. Every time he writes a treatise on a given body of knowledge and tries to explain it to his pupils so that they can grasp it as an art, so that they can master it by understanding not just the how and the what, but also the why and the wherefore. He first defines it, then he breaks it into parts. Okay. Why would it make sense if you're trying to master music, for example? If we're not talking about a complex body of knowledge, there's no reason to really break it down into parts. You can understand it all in a glance. But if you're dealing with complex subject matter, you need to break it into parts. Why would that make sense? I kind of just hinted at the correct answer. Because you can't take it all in at a glance. It makes it more manageable if you study parts, correct? Okay, so then after you break it into parts, you study the parts, and there's 3 things I observe in Aristotle's amazing methodology that really amount to common sense. First is, how is this part like that part? That's genera. How is this part like that part? How are they alike? And the question that follows logically from that is, how do they differ? That's differentia. Have you heard of genera and differentia? What are those? What's that? Yes, and that's the basis of scientific classification. That's how you get kingdom, species, phylum, so forth, right? Okay, so genera, how are the parts alike? Differentia, how do the parts differ from one another? And then what do you suppose the third question you would ask is when you're studying the parts? How do they all work together? You resynthesize and you integrate all the parts into a working whole. Okay? And that's what I call laying a theoretical foundation. And when it comes to art, there's no substitute for theory. Because it's the theory, it's the ability to provide a rational account of not only the how and the what, but also the why and the wherefore that gives you that secure mastery. And that comes through having a theoretical grasp of it. Right? So in that regard, when it comes to cultivating an art, there's no substitute for theory. Say that. There's no substitute for theory. One more time. There's no substitute for theory. There's also no substitute for what? Practicing your scales every day, right? Practice, practice, practice until you go from intuition to Hexxus. Hexxus is the Greek word for habit or habitude. Second nature is what I like to think of it as, second nature. This sounds really lofty, but it's so much common sense, friends. This is just how you think through ideas. You are intuitively predisposed to reason, to rationalize, to analyze, to question, and to persuade others. But just having a knack for that is one thing. And I find in a lot of debate teams, the coaches, especially you see this mostly in IEs, in speaking events, coaches oftentimes just try to take a person's native ability and get them to jump out of their comfort zone and really lose their inhibitions and just cultivate their natural ability, right? But there's no substitute for theory if you're cultivating art, true art. If you're imparting a true art, you need to have people understand why they do what they do. Okay? And once they do that and have a theoretical account for the why and the wherefore, and then practice enough, it becomes second nature. First nature is intuition, second nature is Hexxus. That's when you have an art of thinking quickly on your feet. Okay, the art of rhetoric also entails figures of speech, because human beings are not just logic machines. We're trying to win hearts and minds. Mr. McPeak has that wrapped down really well. He's so good with the ethics of rhetoric. That's why we're close. As he saw that in what I was teaching, and he just latched onto it big time. And he's made a really good career, so to speak, out of passing on to young people the difference between hammering an opponent in order to get some hardware versus speaking the truth in love to my neighbor in order to win hearts and minds and serve my neighbor through mutual search of for truth. So anyway, the art of rhetoric, the techne of rhetoric, has to do with reasoning in this fashion to identify the crux of the matter, and then gathering together the materials that you weave into a case in order to persuade about the crux of the matter. And while you're doing that, you need to appeal to imagination and emotions, because without that, you just have appeals to logic, and that's not necessarily going to move the soul of your audience. What? You're talking about moving the soul of my and even maybe your opponent. Viewing your opponent as your neighbor. What's the essence of the Christian life? Love your neighbor as yourself, right? And so, serving your neighbor by not just doing cutesy Jedi mind tricks on them, or worse, twisting the truth, but but actually, approaching it in an ethical fashion in which truth really means something, and you're attempting to actually make an honest, persuasive case for a point that they may not have considered before in a winsome way. So that's where the canon of style and pathos come in. Have you talked about that in the club? You can find a lot on rhetoricring.com about style and pathos. I think it's where my rhetoric ring really shines, actually. And so that's the art of rhetoric. But Aristotle says, I think my very next slide talks about, rhetoric as the most humane of the humanities. Aristotle starts off his treatise on rhetoric by saying, now, rhetoric is a counterpart of dialectic. And he explains that, and then a little bit later, he relates it also to ethics. The ethics has to do with truth-telling and trust. One of the key elements of persuasion is trust. If I don't trust what you're telling me, or that you know what you're talking about, why would I open myself up to being persuaded by you? That sort of thing. Okay. So he says that rhetoric is related to dialectic very closely and to ethics. And it's also related to psychology. And it's related to politics. And it's related to law and poetics. That's the style, the stylistic dimension, figures of speech and all that. That's the poetic facet of rhetoric. And sermonizing, without the rhetorical arts, sermonizing would not have been as nearly robust and rich as it was throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. The schools of rhetoric is where sermonizing or homiletics really thrived. Okay, and then if your arguments don't have any historicity, Weaver's really good on this. He says arguments, because we appeal to human beings in their fullness, and one of the things we need to do is to actualize the argumentation that we present to human beings, which means in part the arguments must have historicity as well as logic and pathos. So in other words, if you stand here in a debate round and just make a series of abstract arguments that are never brought to bear on anything in the real world, you're not going to be that effective, right? So your arguments need to have historicity. For example, California and Massachusetts and somebody else just legalized pot for recreational purposes. It's worked well for Colorado. It should work for them. Maybe, but what are some of your reasons? Well, if you take a real abstract turn right there, if you don't refer to anything that's gone on in the state of Colorado, I'm trying to update because I always use the Netherlands as the example, but if you try to argue it just as an abstract, say a rights or an abstract economic question, it's not going to have nearly as much impact as if you start to bring to bear on the question at hand historical examples and proofs. Okay, so rhetoric is the most humane of humanities because it either relies on each of these humane studies for its excellence, or it contributes to them directly. And so it's highly implicated in all of these humane studies, and that's why rhetoric is a many-splendored thing. But I wanted to focus on dialectic and ethics tonight. The art of practical reasoning that must be understood side by side with the art of rhetoric in order to have a full and robust art of persuasive argumentation comes through study of dialectics.